so we'll start part 2 of the interview. So we can talk about your really exciting research and your paper that's going to be in Nature.
Yeah. We have a paper coming out in Nature. And like I mentioned earlier, the goal of this paper is really to look at the relationship between human mobility and disease spread, specifically the spread of COVID-19. And so using mobility, we have this really rich, detailed mobility data set from this company, SafeGraph. And using their data, we were able to estimate these networks. And so the network here is, on one hand, we have these local neighborhoods, which are called census block groups. It's approximately 600 to 3,000 people or so. And so we have all these census block groups in the United States. And then we know, based on our networks, their hourly movements to specific points of interest. So these points of interest might be restaurants or cafes or bars or fitness centers or grocery stores, et cetera. And so based on this hourly movement of these pretty fine-grained populations to these individual points of interest, we're able to model the spread of disease. And so, for example, if you have two populations gathering at one restaurant and it's a small restaurant and they're spending a long time there, then our model will predict a certain number of infections coming out of that hour. Yeah. And so using our model, we're able to really estimate who is getting infected, where they're getting infected, and when they're getting infected, down to great granularity. Yeah, so using this model, it's really quite powerful. You can ask a lot of questions. And so there are two main areas of questions that we ask. The first area of questions is around reopening. And so we ask, which places should we reopen? What is the distribution of infections over places? So are there super spreader places, for example? And when should we reopen and how should we reopen? So to give you a little bit of insight into the findings, one finding that we have is there do seem to be point of interest that are super spreaders. And one statistic that can show that is, for example, 10% of the super spreaders in every city that we model account for over 80% of the infections over the 3-month period that we model. Yeah, wow. And so that's really quite extreme, 10% to 85%. And this is true basically across the 10 cities that we model, which are 10 of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States. And so that's one finding that we have. And knowing that there are super spreader locations kind of flips the script a little bit, because I think there's been more of a conversation around super spreader individuals. And that's a really important conversation to have. But to think about locations themselves that might be super spreaders, that might also be something that's easier to tackle from a policy standpoint, because you can do something about that location, whereas individuals, you might not be able to track them down, and you probably shouldn't. So there's an interesting different lever that policymakers can pull if they have this information. So that's one finding we have. Another finding that we have is related to how we should reopen. And so if you think about different partial reopening strategies, for example, one that's really quite attractive that some states have already implemented is you reopen, but you only allow visits to go up to, for example, 25% of the original maximum occupancy. And so using our mobility networks, we simulate what that kind of reopening would look like. We look at 10% of maximum occupancy, 20, 30, 40, 50, all the way up to a complete reopening where you put no cap on the number of visits that are coming in. And so we basically show, when you're using this kind of reopening policy, what is the trade-off that you can get between, first of all, the economy? So you really do want to return visits as much as you can, because that represents businesses, that represents people getting their jobs back, it represents consumer satisfaction. And so that's one side of your trade-off. But the other side of your trade-off is you want to minimize the number of new infections you get out of reopening, right? And so what's really interesting is using our model, you can test different types of reopening strategies and where they fall in that trade-off. How many visits do you get back, but how many infections do you gain? And so we can see that, for example, the reduced maximum occupancy strategy is really effective because, for example, for reducing a few visits, you can reduce infections by a lot. And so that's quite attractive because that gives you some hope in this what otherwise seems like a really difficult trade-off. But in this case, the reduced maximum occupancy strategy is really effective because the intuition there is that you are targeting points of interest in their most dangerous periods. And so if you think about a point of interest, it's probably not a super spreader all the time. Like there are probably certain hours when a bunch of people are coming at the same time and staying for a long time, and that's what makes it dangerous. And so using this maximum occupancy strategy, You can say, okay, you can't exceed 25% of your maximum occupancy. You're not going to have those peaks of dangerousness anymore. And so essentially you're taking away visits in the smartest way possible. You're taking away visits when they would have added the most to risk. Whereas if you have low risk periods when there's only a few people coming into the store, you can keep that. People can still come into the store at that time. And so the reduced maximum occupancy strategy is really very flexible, and it touches POI's points of interest at their most dangerous times. And so we recommend it as a good strategy. Moving into the other main thrust of our work. So I talked about reopening, and the other thing that we can study with the work, because recall, our model is able to predict who is infected, when, and where. So we talked about the when and where, and now we'll talk about the who. So the who is being infected. One really big question around COVID that is really important to answer is, why are lower income neighborhoods, less white neighborhoods getting infected at higher rates? And we've seen a lot of statistics around this. This is pretty much a proven fact. But the question is, why is this happening? And so our model is able to show that mobility actually probably plays a big role in that. And so from the mobility data alone, the model was able to predict these disparities correctly. And so, yeah, so that's pretty interesting, I think. And so based on that finding, then we looked into the mobility data and we asked, what are the mechanisms within the mobility data that's allowing the model to make this prediction, this correct prediction about less white census block groups and less lower income census block groups getting infected at higher rates? And so we find that there are two major mechanisms in the mobility data that can answer this. So one of the mechanisms is that lower income and less white neighborhoods were not able to reduce their mobility as much when March hit. And so if you look at a graph that shows mobility over time, you see that the lower income neighborhoods, their line for mobility doesn't go down as much as the line for the higher income neighborhoods. And the same is true for less white and more white neighborhoods. And so that's the first thing. Lower income and less white were not able to reduce their mobility as much. And there's a lot of real world reasons that we might be able to use to explain this. We didn't test this in our work, but it could have to do with the fact that lower income and less white neighborhoods are probably disproportionately represented in essential worker jobs and maybe are less able to work from home. And so that's one thing. They weren't able to reduce their mobility as much. But the other mechanism is also really interesting, which is that even when you think about, even if people went out equally much, lower income neighborhoods and less white neighborhoods would still be at more risk. And this is because the points of interest that they go to tend to be more crowded, tend to be smaller, and people tend to stay there for longer. And so one statistic is, even if you only looked at grocery stores, the grocery stores that lower income and less white neighborhoods tend to go to tend to be like 2 times more dangerous than the grocery stores that higher income and more white neighborhoods go to. And the reason for this can be broken down into a number of factors. The grocery stores that lower income neighborhoods go to are smaller. People stay there, I think, for like 17% longer. And so overall, it's much more crowded, maybe like 35 or even 50% more crowded. And overall, this compounds into a 2 times rate of transmission risk. And so it's quite interesting that there are both of these mechanisms. They're going out more, and also they're going to more dangerous places at no fault of their own. It's just, this is what's available to them in their neighborhood, or this is what their job is. Sure. And so I think this is quite important to know, because there could be a number of different mechanisms that are driving these disparities. And I think earlier we thought a big part of it was caused by pre-existing conditions or different access to healthcare. And these are probably huge factors as well. But to know that mobility is playing a large role gives us, again, some way for policymakers to make short-term policy decisions that could maybe actually reduce disparities a little bit. And so if you know that mobility is playing a part in it, maybe you want to, for example, send more PPE to low-income and less white neighborhoods, increase testing. We already are doing that a little bit, but we know that could help more. Maybe you want to take more stringent reopening approaches, because you know that maybe reopening won't affect the overall population that much, but vulnerable groups it will affect a lot more. And so I think, for example, in California, they have this sort of equity consideration in reopening. And they're saying you have to consider your most vulnerable population before you're allowed to reopen and move on to the next phase. And so I think those kinds of considerations are great. And to think about not just the overall population, but these subpopulations when you're deciding on reopening policies and considering possible disparities in the reopening impact.
Wow. So my next question was who will benefit from your research, but it's pretty obvious. Everybody.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, government, schools, industry, everybody benefits from this.
I'd like to think so. Yeah. I mean, I think it also falls on us to see whether we can actually get the tool out to people. So right now, we've written a paper, it's a Nature paper, it's very exciting. But the next step, I think, is to get out of the academic bubble and really create a tool online that anyone can use. And so that's what we've been working on for the past few weeks, coming up with this public-facing tool on a website where essentially policymakers or any curious individual in the public can put our model to the test. And so they can say, oh, I want to see what would happen if I reopen restaurants, or I want to know what would happen if I reopened restaurants but didn't open gyms, didn't open cafes. And so we're coming up with a tool right now that anybody can use. They put in some parameters, they press play, and they'll get back the model projections. So they'll get back, for example, information related to how many POI visits, points of interest visits, would this cost if I close down restaurants, for example. So that's the economic standpoint. And they would get back a prediction of how many infections would this result in. And then they would also get back a prediction of how would this impact lower income versus higher income neighborhoods, and how would this impact less white versus more white neighborhoods. And so we're trying to really get this information out so that hopefully it can really make some change. So yeah, on that note, we're hoping this can benefit policymakers. We're trying to reach out to policymakers now as well to get their opinions on what would be most helpful to them. Hopefully it can benefit businesses so that they can have a better sense of when their busiest hours might be, what sorts of strategies might be able to reduce infections at their places. It can hopefully benefit society in the sense of, the public can be more informed. And also, if we can make better policies, of course, it's going to affect society as well. And then finally, we're hoping this can benefit other scientists as well. And so our model from a methodological standpoint it's a novel model. We created it just for this paper, and it does, to an unprecedented degree, give us a granular sense of what's happening on the ground. And so there have been other models that have used mobility data, but it's usually at a more aggregated level, for example, at the county or the state level. And what we have here to the individual points of interest, I think I haven't really seen many other models like that. And so hopefully this can also inspire other scientists to take this more granular approach and think about what's happening on the ground.
Oh, yes. All the things that you said. Yes, yes, yes. I think that this is going to be something phenomenal. I can't wait to try it out. So since it could and possibly, hopefully will affect a lot of people, all age ranges, how would you describe this now to a third grader, right? Yeah. So in the simplest terms, how would you describe your research?
Yeah, this is a hard one. So I would start by, I think, trying to explain this relationship between mobility and COVID. And so maybe an intuitive idea is if one person is sick and they're standing very close to another person, they might get that other person sick, maybe by coughing, maybe because they're sharing the same air. That's the basic idea. So if you're really sick, you don't want to be near other people. And if there's a lot of people who are close to each other, then a lot of people might catch the disease. And we're trying to make people not get sick. And so this is maybe why school has been closed for you for the last few months. And maybe that's why you're taking classes online. And that's because we don't want to get you or your family sick. We don't want you to be around too many other people because the disease might spread that way. So that's the main idea. We don't want too many people to be close to each other. The question, though, is we don't always know whether people are getting close to each other or not. And so this is what we're trying to do with our research. We can use GPS data from cell phones to know whether people are getting close to each other, for example, in restaurants, in cafes, in gyms, in grocery stores, the kinds of places you might be visiting. And we can, based on cell phone data, we can figure out how much time people are spending close to each other and how many people are coming close to each other. And so based on all of that information, we can then predict how many people have caught the disease. And also based on that information, we can predict what kinds of places people are going to so that we can stop them from going to those places so that hopefully they don't keep spreading the disease. I don't know if that was good. That was my attempt.
Perfect. I feel like a third grader would understand that. I can't go to school because a lot of people are at school.
Exactly.
Where there's a lot of people. So
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
for
This was fun.
chatting. And we look forward to this paper coming out.